Blake, would you like to know what's going on with Tesla?
Boy, would I.
So, we didn't do a podcast after the Q4 results, and that was on purpose. We did a podcast after Q2 of 2017 and Q3. They seem to be our most popular podcasts so far. So, I guess we could just milk Tesla, do a podcast on Tesla every week for lots of views, but
Nah.
I think we'd run out of content. We didn't do Q4 because everything that was a giant dumpster fire at the end of Q3 remained a giant dumpster fire, only it got worse. So every number that mattered to the financials of Tesla got worse. The losses got worse. They set a new record for bottom line losses in the quarter. And I didn't feel like we could make a compelling podcast about that. And I was even starting to doubt, can we make a compelling podcast for Q1 2018? And I was really on the fence because we're kind of in a period of Tesla's life where it's slowly spiraling out of control. And it's kind of like an airplane that has some catastrophic defect and you know it's going to crash, but you're not quite sure if it's just going to have like this slow glide into the ground or if suddenly the whole tail is going to break off and then it just drops like a rock. And so it wasn't entirely obvious, and it just, was there enough to do on Q1? Well, we're recording this on April 1st of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So Q1 results are not out yet. Q1 has ended. Sometime 2 or 3 days from now, I think Wednesday, April 4th, they're going to release the production and delivery numbers, which is just how many cars did they build and deliver. It won't be financial numbers of dollars around those vehicles. It'll just be the number of cars. So that'll be kind of interesting, but the financial numbers won't come out until sometime the second week of May. So you typically have about a 6-week delay from the end of the quarter until they're done cooking the books sufficiently to release them.
Do you have any forward-looking predictions about the number of cars they've produced and shipped?
It seems that the demand for the S and X has dropped a lot. And there are probably a couple good reasons for this. So before we get into that, I want to set the stage. And I want to say the reason we've decided to do this podcast is because this previous week has been very eventful for Tesla. Things kind of started maybe 12 days ago or so. You had this Uber autonomous car in Arizona that killed a pedestrian who was crossing the street. And now Tesla's not involved with that at all. But it kind of set up everything where people are starting to say, hey, maybe this autonomous thing, maybe I should just second guess it a little bit. I don't know how far we should second guess it. Of course, you have like these reactionaries who say, throw it all away. It was all crap to start with and it was never going to work. And this just proves it because one person died. And, and then you have other people at the far other end who are like, just keep testing on roadways. It was bound to happen eventually. And there are a lot of interesting mitigating circumstances and engineering conversation about that. And maybe one day we'll do a podcast on that event once the NTSB releases their report. But
we definitely should.
It set the stage for coming into this previous week of Tesla's history. So what else set up for this? Well, back in November, Tesla did their reveal of the Semi and the Roadster 2. And we thought, hey, they're going to get all this money, this huge infusion of cash from deposits. And when the Q1 results came out, it turned out that those deposits were much less than people had estimated. People had estimated that they would get somewhere upwards of $400 million in deposits. And it turned out they only got about 170 million of deposits. So 170 million is only enough to keep the lights on at Tesla for a couple of weeks. At the end of Q4, they exited the quarter with $3.5 billion in cash. And that sounds okay. They've stated publicly before that they would like to have $1 billion on hand at all times as a cushion to run their company with. And certainly claiming that they've exited the quarter with $3.5 billion sounds great. But when you look at their balance statements, that accompanied that quarter, they had $2.5 billion of accounts payables. So to make an analogy of this, let's say like your mom came and visited you and you were like, Mom, I'm such a responsible adult. I've got $35,000 in the bank. And she's like, good job, son. And then you're like, also, the sharks are after me for 25,000 bucks that I owe them. And then she kind of looks at you weird and she's like, when you take 35,000 that you have in the bank and you subtract the 25,000 that the sharks are going to break your kneecaps over, you've only got 10,000 left, son. That's really what Tesla was doing. They inflated their accounts payable by stringing out their suppliers. So they stopped paying their suppliers, or rather they increase the amount of time. So they're not technically delinquent, they're just stretching out to the full extent of the terms that they're allowed with their suppliers. But it means that their accounts payable went from about 1.5 billion at the end of Q3 to 2.5 billion at the end of Q4. But because they hadn't paid that money, they got to say, look, we got 3.5 billion in cash on hand. And if you go and look at their initial press release, that's like the top line item. We exited the quarter with 3.5 billion of cash, and then buried way, way, way down there in some charts of numbers are 2.5 billion in accounts payables. So they also released at the end of the fourth quarter this really squirrely statement about how many Model 3s they're building, which of course is the most important number. If there's only one number that you could pull out of Elon right now, that's the one you would want to know, is how many Model 3s are you building every day or every week? In their statement, they said that they had made 793 Model 3s in the last 7 days of the fourth quarter. But that in the last few days, and they didn't define few, we hit a production rate on each of our manufacturing lines that extrapolates to over 1,000 Model 3s per week. So think of this in the mathematical terms. They produced 793 total in the final 7 days. But let's say in the last 2 days, because they just said few and they didn't define that. Let's say in the last 2 days, they pulled out all the stops and they produced what? 100 and what's 1,000 divided by 7? That's 140.
140 per day.
Yeah. So let's say they produce 140 per day, all hands on deck, everybody working overtime, the factory running 24 hours a day for 2 days. And they suddenly surged and they pushed out 140 cars per day. And then they said, well, that extrapolates to 1,000 a week. And so you can see this is a really squirrely statement that you don't want to use this kind of stuff as an engineer. You want to say exactly what did we produce. What you would really like to say is on the final day, we produced this many, and be specific and say, how did we get there? Did we produce it under normal factory operations, or did we game this number? And this way they made the statement is very misleading, and it's open to interpretation if you have a critical eye towards it.
What's your guess?
Well, they did say they made 793 in the last 7 days. I think their actual run rate at the end of Q4 was probably something about 600 per week. Their sustainable run rate. I think they gamed that number at the end, and so the last couple days were higher production than they could sustain over a long period. And so I think their actual sustainable production at the end of Q4 was probably about 600 per week.
My guess would be that they just got lucky on those days and didn't have any production stoppages. And so in theory, if they could make it where they never have a production stoppage ever again, probably that's a realistic rate, except that would be asking them to estimate how many unexpected events will occur.
So the point of the statement was they were trying to lead investors to believe that they were exiting Q4 at a run rate of 1,000 Model 3s per week. So as we got into Q1 and Q1 started rolling through and we got through the end of January, the VIN tracking that people do, which is inaccurate, but it's an okay estimate. So you have to take it with a grain of salt and understand that it's not completely accurate. The VIN tracking was indicating that they weren't producing 1,000 per week even halfway through Q1, that they were not keeping up that rate at a steady state. And the other thing it was showing is that all through Q1, the registration numbers for the S and the X had collapsed. Now, the way that they do this specifically for the S and X, there are a lot of jurisdictions, various countries or states or provinces or cities, things like that, that report registration numbers of new cars. And some of them report them daily. The websites get updated every day. And so people have gone through of all the places in the world that do this, and they monitor these sites. And they look for Model S and Model X registrations, and then they add them to a giant Google Docs spreadsheet, and they track it all the time. And so what they can look at is compared to, day 50 of Q1 of 2018 compared to day 50 of Q1 of 2017, how many S's and X's had been registered. And so this is on the delivery and registration side, not on the production side. And so there's a gap in those things because you have to physically move a car from the Fremont factory to the customer after you produce it before you deliver it. And then some cars go into test drive fleets and showroom fleets and loaner fleets and things like that too. So there's always discrepancies in there that you're trying to adjust for. But the registration numbers all through Q1 had showed that Tesla was probably going to be somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 Model S and X combined short of their 25,000 implied guidance. Then sometime near the beginning of March of 2018, it was found out that Tesla had shut down the Model 3 assembly line for a week at the end of February. And of course, there's wild speculation. First, there's wild speculation of, hey, this is material to investors. Why did Elon not tell us? Why did he not quickly tweet out an update that the line was shut down and they weren't going to be producing any Model 3s this week? Certainly, any investor would think it was material when the car that your entire company's future is riding on is not being produced for a week straight. Tesla, though, claimed that it was for upgrades and quality improvements, that you could shut the line down and do a bunch of fixes to the assembly line so that the cars that then started coming out of it later were of better quality. And certainly that's plausible. You just have to decide what percentage do you believe it was because of them improving the line? What percentage do you believe it was because they were turning out such crappy cars that it was just undeliverable and there was no reason to run the line until they got it fixed?
Those are the same, right?
Well, I I think it depends on how lenient you are towards Tesla. Right? Is it because it was a good faith effort to make the line better? Or is it because, man, the last 200 cars we've turned out are undeliverable and have to be fixed by hand? Which is what happens. And that even happens with real car companies. Once in a while, a car comes off the assembly line and it has a problem and it has to be fixed by hand before it leaves the factory. But a large, well-run car company will have that happen very, very rarely. Now, they're also running out a lot more cars per day. And so, it may look like they have a dozen cars being worked by hand at any given moment, but, Ford produces an F-Series pickup truck about every 20 seconds. So, it's okay if there's 12 at a time that need hand rework. But for Tesla, if you're producing 100 or 140 cars a day and you have to hand rework enough that it's backed up and you need to just shut down the assembly line, that's a lot worse. So it's a matter of how much the shutdown is because we should really fix these things or how much it's because we have no other choice. Was it choice or necessity?
Yeah.
I think is the distinction.
Yeah.
Now, you can go on YouTube and you can search around and you can find video after video of Model 3 in an owner's hand with some kind of crazy problem. There's no end to the number of unique problems that people are discovering with their Model 3s. And it's no surprise, Tesla skipped the industry standard production part approval process where you make sure that every part itself is designed correctly. They skipped professional beta testing and they skipped the assembly line beta testing. So the way that a car company normally brings out a new car is they design a car and then they design all the parts and they get with the suppliers and they say, supply us a couple of test versions of all these parts. And the supplier builds them and sends them. And then they approve the supplier's building of the part. They basically bless the supplier and say, you can build this competently to our spec. Then they integrate the assembly line. They debug the assembly line while running it at very low speed. And then those cars that are coming off the assembly line at low speed are given to professional beta testers. So this is a job that I didn't even know existed. And when I tell this story to people, no one I've run into yet knows that this is a real job, but a professional car beta tester.
I had never heard of it.
And so, yeah, who has? So these are people who get hired on contract by car companies to take a beta car and then just drive it. And they have experience and training ferreting out problems, diagnosing them, giving good engineering feedback to the designers, and helping the car company to wring out the bugs of the vehicle. And this typically goes on for about a year. This is an iterative process where the assembly line is fixed, the beta testers get new cars, they drive them around for a while, they find a problem, it goes back to the designers, they fix a part, they go through the approval process with the supplier of that part again, and this whole thing iterates again and again and again until you get it fixed. Tesla said, we don't need to do any of that. Just start the assembly line and start putting cars in customers' hands with no beta testing, with no production part approval process. So they threw out the entirety of the standard industry model and said, we don't need any of that. And that's why you can go to YouTube and find video after video of wild and crazy problems with Teslas. Videos where guys are trying to desperately drive their Model 3 back to the service center and it keeps shutting down on the side of the road. So there's no end to it. But it's all because they skip that whole process and they're creating very, very low quality cars. So their service centers are getting backed up because of it. There are reports on various Tesla forums, Teslarati, Tesla Motor Club, Model 3 Owners Club, those kind of forums, that people are getting quoted weeks before a technician can look at the problem on their car in some cases, depending on the part of the country you're in and how many Model 3s have been delivered there. And so the backup is getting really bad. The whole time that the Model 3 has been anticipated, a lot of people have been expecting it to be this $35,000 car. And indeed, Tesla has always, and the news media too, has always termed it the $35,000 Model 3. And early on, Tesla would talk about it and they would say it's $35,000 before incentives. And they're talking about the $7,500 tax credit that you can get for buying an EV. So it was always marketed as this. Now, you know from our Q2 podcast that, man, that car doesn't cost anywhere near $35,000. You still can't buy a Tesla anywhere near that price. $47,000 is the cheapest Tesla you can buy today, or Model 3, sorry. The cheapest Model 3, $47,000 if you want black. If you want a color other than black, it's an extra $1,000. So just recently, they've stopped referring to the car as the $35,000 Model 3, and Tesla has started calling the $35,000 Model 3 simply a variant of the car. because they know that they'll never make a penny of profit selling that car for $35,000. They may not make a penny of profit selling it for $47,000. But they've changed the way that they talk about the car, where now if you want one that only costs $35,000, that's just a variant. That's not the car. And then you add on to it with different packages on top of that. So there's been kind of this communication difference that they've switched to that's important if you know what to look for, that the margins are terrible on the car. They need the high dollar upgrades, the long range battery, the luxury option, autopilot, and full self-driving. They need to sell you all that stuff because those are all high margin upgrades to ever have a chance of making a profit on the car. And near the same time that they changed the way they communicate that, people who had been invited to configure cars on the website started being told that if they wanted the $35,000 version, it was going to be another 6 months. So it's going to be late 2018 before that one's available. Now, pretty soon, Tesla's going to hit the 200,000th car sold in America, which means that their $7,500 tax credit for their customers will start winding down. And that was a big deal to a lot of customers. It was a $35,000 car minus $7,500 in the form of an income tax rebate. And that's going to start going away. It phases out in a system over about 15 months or so. But that window for them to capture sales to those people is starting to close because they've put off the $35,000 variant. Mm. And when they announced that, those Tesla fan site forums had lots of posts from people saying, I was here for the $35,000 car and the $7,500 of free money from the government. I'm done. And people starting to request the refunds of their $1,000 deposits from Tesla. So that brings us, all of that history kind of brings us to this past week. And we get here, and what starts happening? Wednesday, March 21st. So I'm going to go day by day here because the events so much happened. We'll actually go back an extra half week. Wednesday, March 21st. Elon Musk's new pay package was approved by the stockholders of Tesla. So they approved it by a 73% vote of the stockholders who are eligible to vote. So essentially, the board recuses itself from voting, and so a couple other people recuse themselves. And then all of the remaining shares that were represented by votes, 73% voted to approve his new pay package. Now, the size of his pay package is variously reported, and it's stock grants. And so the size of the package depends on the value of the stock, but it's variously reported from $2.6 billion to $55 billion, depending on how you account it.
That's quite a broad range.
Yeah, but you'll see why. The way it's set up, he hits various milestones that are based on Tesla's market cap, so essentially its stock price increasing, and it achieving certain revenue and certain what's called EBITDA, EBITDA. It's an accounting term for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. We won't go into what that is. Don't worry about it. But basically, he can achieve the entirety of the pay package. He can earn every reward under this newly voted pay package without ever producing a single dollar of profit from Tesla. It doesn't require the company to ever make a cent. And so he can simply issue new stock over and over and over in order to raise the market cap of the company, use the money he gets from issuing the new stock to buy whatever unprofitable company. Doesn't matter what industry they're in, what they produce. Doesn't matter if they have a penny of profit. As long as they have a ton of revenue that Tesla then absorbs into their company, he meets the milestones and he earns these shares. And so there's no incentive in this package for him to ever turn Tesla into a profitable company. But theoretically, he could achieve all these things and make up to $55 billion.
So you're expecting Tesla to maybe buy a few more companies in the near future?
It's certainly an option. Now, I think Tesla is going to have a lot of problems in the near future that will probably prevent them from buying too many more. They bought a couple of companies in the last 6 months. They bought Grauman Engineering, which was a German company that worked in the automotive parts industry. They bought them. They bought another company. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was something that had real synergy with Tesla, like something it desperately needed to ring out the Model 3 line. And they basically just issued some new stock and gave it to the owner in exchange for the company. So they certainly could just buy a bunch more companies. There's no disincentive to it. And there's a definite incentive to Elon Musk to do it. So I try to veer away from forward-looking statements because all I can say factually is what has happened. Now, I can say something may happen. I may feel that it has a certain percentage chance of happening. It's obviously, as engineers, it's a difficult topic to say what exactly will happen.
I'm just trying to make you sound like a prophet if they go on a company buying spree.
Oh, I don't need to sound like a prophet.
Okay.
That's not required for me. So Friday, March 23rd, you get 2 days later, you had an event where a person driving a Model X in Mountain View, California, crashed and was killed. He was a young engineer at Apple, it turned out. And the initial reports say that he crashed into a dividing barrier on the highway, and then 2 other cars hit him. You can see pictures of it. The whole Model X from the firewall forward is burned almost to nothing. The forward passenger side wheel is still there. There are a lot of problems that went on with this. So the first problem is the crash attenuator, which is that little tin or steel thing that you're supposed to crash into on a divider on the highway that absorbs your impact. That had already been crushed in another crash a couple days earlier, and it hadn't been replaced yet. So when he hit the divider, he just hit the divider. He didn't have the attenuator there to help absorb the impact. Then the car caught on fire somehow. When the firefighters arrived, they realized it was a battery fire. They didn't understand how to treat the situation, so they initially did not try to fight the fire or rescue the driver. And so he was trapped in the car for quite a while it was burning. It appears from initial reports. Now, this is all initial reports, and journalists are mostly idiots who suck. And all of this could change pending the NTSB report. So if you listen to this in 2020 and you've studied the NTSB report, don't come back and say that I'm an idiot. This is based on what's in the news so far. So it appears that for some amount of time, I don't know how long, they left the driver in the burning car. They eventually extricated him, took him to the hospital, and he died later at the hospital of his injuries. So looking back at this Uber crash several days before, maybe a week before that, people started saying, well, I wonder if, Tesla's Autopilot was engaged. Now, Tesla's Autopilot is basically a level 2 autonomy with the limits set such that it's pretty dangerous, but it's not level 4 or level 5 like Uber was testing in Arizona. So it's kind of a different beast, but it has some of the same capabilities. And it turns out in later days, the family of the victim in this crash knew that he had a history of problems with his Model X at this spot on the highway. And so in autopilot mode, his Model X had repeatedly veered towards that crash barrier at that spot in the road. And he had taken the car into Tesla to a service center and complained of the problem. His family turned invoices of those service calls from Tesla over to the NTSB to aid their investigation. And each time he took the car in, Tesla would look at it. They would run diagnostics. They would say, we can't find a problem. I'm not sure if Tesla ever actually drove the car past that barrier to see if they could recreate it, while having the car instrumented, but they basically said there was nothing they could do about it. And so eventually he crashed into that barrier, and he was unlucky enough that the crash attenuator was not there at the time, and he was killed.
It does sort of raise the question of why was he using autopilot past that point, not manually monitoring it.
Maybe he was just being an engineer, and he was like, I'm gonna monitor this and see how often it does this. I'm gonna take a little bit of data every day on the way to work or the way home. I don't know which way he was going. But he was an engineer at Apple.
He's gambling a lot on it.
He certainly was. He had a lot of faith in Autopilot, and I don't know that faith was misplaced. I mean, there have been a lot of miles driven with Autopilot and not many deaths. So there have been a few. There's like 3 or 4 known deaths because of Autopilot. But I don't know, was he gambling much more than any other driver on that freeway that day?
I don't know, because we know that the autopilot's pretty safe, but we also know that the autopilot working with the human together is safer. And if he had, in theory, had a specific problem at that specific point, you would think that he would say, oh, we're about to get to that point, and then he would pay extra attention right there every day. I know that I encounter that on 101 on my daily commute, where there's specific potholes, and I pay attention to them and then dodge around them, and then I kind of go back to the sort of zoned out mode of I'm just on cruise control commuting.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I would pay extra attention to things that could kill me.
Yeah, and the nature of this veering towards that crash barrier has not come out yet that I know of. So you can imagine 2 situations. If you think of driving your car down the road and all of a sudden you see a target off the road, say 100 feet away, and you just turn your steering wheel a little bit so that you start veering straight towards that target. That's one way you could veer into that crash barrier. But another way is you're driving in your lane and all of a sudden the steering jerks over at maximum angular displacement, trying to put you into that barrier. And then there's a whole spectrum in between those 2 possibilities. And we're not really sure. I'm not sure. I mean, I know Tesla is sure and the NTSB is sure, but I don't know yet which of those it was. And that's certainly important. If the car just suddenly jerked very hard towards the crash barrier, and some days it did it and some days it did not do it, and then one day it does it in a slightly different way and there's no crash attenuator, then it could suddenly be fatal. Where before it was just like, whoa, it jerks out of control a little bit there, and I tightened my grip because of course I would never drive without my hands on the wheel. And so I just pull back into my lane.
Are you going to get into Tesla's statements about what he was doing at the time?
Yeah, we'll come to that later.
All right.
Yeah, because they made a press release about that the next week. I'm trying to keep this on a timeline. I don't know if I should really dive down each subject or if I should stay with the timeline.
Now let's go with the timeline. Go for it.
All right. So the next day, Saturday, March 24th, Tesla slowed deliveries to Norway. Now, most people are going to be like, who cares about Norway? Norway is held up as this like bellwether of EV demand. And so they're a country that has heavy government subsidies for EVs. They publish good registration numbers regularly so that it's easy to track what's going on. And they're one of Tesla's largest markets because of the subsidies. And so outside of California, it's one of the largest ones. But the demand in Norway had been well short of what it had been in first quarter of 2017. And so people were wondering, how's Norway going? And suddenly Tesla makes a press release and says, look, we've slowed down deliveries to Norway, but we did it not because the demand is collapsing, but because of safety. And so their excuse was they had to ship cars to a different port in Norway than they normally use. And because of that, they couldn't then ship them on to their delivery center in the normal way. So they had to use truckers to transport them to the delivery center. The truckers were, some of them at least, were unlicensed or otherwise in violation of Norwegian commercial driving laws. And then one of them got in a wreck. And so there's some photos on the internet of like 3 or 4 brand new Teslas on a car transporter that are just very, very damaged now. Like the roofs are collapsed when he got in this wreck. And so suddenly it came out, oh man, Tesla's using these like illegal truckers, and one of them got in a wreck, and it's this huge safety problem. And it just looks kind of bad, I guess. I don't know. Maybe you don't think that the government should put so many restrictions on commercial truckers, but
Let's call them outlaw truckers.
rebel truckers. So it was just kind of a stupid black eye, it's like, this is not an issue that's going to make Tesla sink or swim, but it's just one of those kind of corporate PR things where you need to run out in front and spin that thing. And the way Tesla spun it was, hey, we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We can preemptively explain why deliveries in Norway collapsed, and we can say that we're cleaning up our act and we're doing it for safety. And so they came out with this press release and said that they're slowing deliveries. Now, the number of deliveries had been much slower than they were first quarter of 2017. And, they handled more deliveries a year ago just fine. But now for safety, they're going to slow it. So for people who spend way too much time following Tesla, you saw that and you were like, yeah, they're bullshitting us. They're blowing smoke up our asses. But, from a corporate PR standpoint, it's like, oh, they're good people. They're doing it for safety. So we get around to Tuesday, March 27th. The first big thing that happens that day is Moody's downgrades Tesla's credit rating. So Moody's and S&P are 2 credit rating, they're companies that analyze different companies, and they say, what is your credit worthiness, the same way individuals have credit scores. And so when a company wants to borrow money, issue bonds, things like that, they pay certain rates depending on the credit ratings that Moody's and S&P have assigned to them. So it's a big deal when a company gets a downgrading in their rating. It means that the cost of them borrowing money will go up. And it doesn't just mean that the cost of them borrowing money in the future goes up. There are certain types of debt that companies regularly have that depend on their current credit rating. So it's adjustable rate debt. As a result of that, the bonds that they issued last July, that $1.8 billion of junk bonds, they lost a lot of value on the secondary market. So Tesla issued these bonds last July, bunch of banks bought them, and then banks might keep some, banks might sell them. So a secondary market emerges where people trade these bonds around, they buy and sell them. But the price of them on the secondary market changes based on people's current assumptions for how likely Tesla is to pay them back. And the way that changes is the price you pay for the bond goes up or down relative to, say, the $100 benchmark price that it was originally issued at. So what you can do is you can say, well, if I can buy this bond at a discount today because people have less faith that Tesla will ever be able to pay it back, so they're willing to sell it at a discount, then I can compute what the implied interest rate is. So I know the payments that Tesla will pay on this bond every year based on the original terms, and I can buy it at a discount to what the original buyer bought for. And you do a ratio of those numbers and you come up with the implied interest rate. So initially when Tesla issued those bonds, I believe it was at 5.3% interest rate. And today the implied interest rate is 7.7%, which means that people think Tesla is more likely to go bankrupt now than they did last July. So the other reason that this really hurts is you look at these most recent junk bonds, they are unsecured bonds. So if Tesla goes bankrupt, you're just SOL. There's nothing you can claim against the bond. It's indicative of what Tesla will have to pay if it tries to issue new bonds. Tesla as a company is leveraged to the hilt. Virtually every asset they have is promised as collateral for some kind of loan. They almost have no assets that are not promised. So if they try to issue more bonds, they're almost certainly going to have to be unsecured bonds, just like these are. So it's useful to look at these bonds in the secondary market, see what is the implied interest rate, and that's essentially what the market is pricing new debt from Tesla that is also unsecured. So it's a forward-looking indicator of what they would pay today for new unsecured debt. And 7.7% is really high. So also on Tuesday, March 27th, there were some emails leaked from Tesla. And they were giving approval to the sales centers to sell test drive and display vehicles with discounts until the end of the quarter, until March 31st, as long as they could also be delivered in the quarter. So essentially what they're trying to do was say, look, you've got these extra units, they've got a few miles on them. If they're a test unit, maybe they're a display unit, they don't have any miles on them, but they're sitting there, they're ready to go. And if you can find a buyer, give them these discounts and get the car out the door before the end of the quarter so we can juice the numbers. Now, they've done this a lot. If you look back at the history of Tesla financial statements, the actual worded part from the company where they talk about how they did, it's always about revenue, it's about sales, and it's about delivery. It's never about profit because there are never any profits. And so you can always juice the revenue and the sales and the deliveries by just offering discounts. And as people like to say online, if I had a business selling $100 for $90, I could have really high revenues, very high sales and delivery numbers. My profit would be terrible. And that's essentially what Tesla's doing. The next day, Wednesday, March 28th, a judge in a lawsuit against Tesla ruled that the lawsuit can continue forward. So when Tesla bailed out Solar City, it was supposedly because there were these great synergies between the companies and that it would be beneficial for Tesla to buy a bankrupt solar energy company. Obviously, as we've explained on previous Tesla podcasts, it was a bailout of Elon, his brother, and his two cousins because they all had significant investments in Solar City. Elon was on the board. One of his cousins was the CEO of Solar City. The whole thing was this disgusting bailout of their investment. And they did it on the back of Tesla shareholders. So a lawsuit eventually came out of that saying that essentially there was conflict of interest, there was dereliction of duty of the board members for approving this, and that it shouldn't have gone forward, and that Tesla shareholders have been materially hurt by it, which I would agree they have, and there's more hurting in store over Solar City. But what this legal ruling that happened on March 28th is Tesla did a very standard motion to dismiss and basically say, this lawsuit has no merit. It shouldn't even proceed forward to the point where we make arguments against each other. And the judge said, I don't really think so. I think that it has merit to proceed. But these kind of motion to dismiss hearings, they operate under different rules of evidence. And so typically the judge will assume that all of the plaintiff's complaints are true. And then he will say, if they were all true, would this be a good lawsuit? And he just answers yes or no. And then later they come in and they make their complaints and they try to establish whether or not they're true. And so it doesn't mean that Tesla really did shaft their shareholders, which they did, but it put Tesla in the news in a bad way because essentially they have shareholders suing them over this crony bailout that Musk did of his family members. So we get to the next day, Thursday, March 29th, and we have more leaked emails from Tesla, this time from Doug Field, Senior Vice President of Engineering. And Peter Hochholdinger, I believe his name is pronounced, He's the VP of production. It turns out that the Model S and X assembly lines were slowed or maybe shut down. Employees were pulled off of those assembly lines to work on the Model 3 assembly line in an attempt to burst the production at the end of the quarter so that they could claim higher sustained run rates the same way they had done in Q4. And so literally they were caught red-handed trying to fudge the numbers of Model 3 run rate at the end of the quarter. So it doesn't matter if you pull every employee, if they pull all 30,000 plus Tesla employees from everywhere all over the world, they pack them all into Fremont, and they all hammer together Model 3s all night long. It doesn't matter if you hit 5,000 Model 3s per week as an extrapolated run rate. What really matters is what is your steady state run rate under your normal production conditions. That's what investors need to know. And Tesla is caught red-handed trying to fudge that number here by slowing down the other assembly line that produces both the S and the X together, moving employees over, and bursting the run rate on the Model 3 for a few days. So everybody's suspicion at the end of Q4 that they may have just been bursting for a couple days to claim they had exited Q4 at 1,000 Model 3s per week was confirmed. Because here they were with a leaked email doing the same thing at the end of Q1 of 2018. Now, ironically, in the email, Doug Field, Senior Vice President of Engineering, criticizes Tesla's critics and short sellers about being haters and we need to prove them wrong and this kind of thing. So he's kind of, beating the drum, trying to raise morale and be like, yeah, let's get out there and produce a bunch of cars and prove these haters wrong and these short sellers. The irony of it, of course, is that Doug Field himself, Senior Vice President of Tesla, a member of the board of directors, sells all the vested Tesla stock he receives every quarter immediately. So you can go on the SEC's website. He's considered an insider because he's a member of the board, and he has to file paperwork when he sells Tesla stock or buys it. And you can look back through his history, and every 3 months, like clockwork, he sells a huge tranche of vested shares of Tesla. So he's out here criticizing people for being short sellers, for being haters of the company. He apparently has no faith himself because he divests himself of Tesla stock as soon as he gets it. Now, also somewhat ironically, Kimball Musk, Elon Musk's brother, who is also on the board of directors, does the same exact thing. Keep that in mind if you've made it nearly an hour into this podcast and you love Tesla and you think they're going to be the first $1 trillion company, that the brother of the CEO and the senior vice president of engineering and several other people who have now left the company all sell their stock as soon as it vests and get out of it. So you can even go to the SEC's website and there's nice search features. You can look up what the boards of directors for the companies you work for do with their stock and see if they're doing the same thing. So later that same day, March 29th, after the market had closed, of course, for the long Easter weekend, the best time to break news after market close on a 3-day weekend, Tesla released a press release saying that they were recalling 123,000 Model S's built before 2016 for a steering issue. So what this involves are some bolts in the steering system. It's not entirely clear, did Tesla choose the wrong bolt, or did Tesla choose the correct bolt, but the bolt delivered by the sub-supplier was not the bolt that Tesla specified? That's unknown right now. Now, either way, Tesla has a duty to make sure the parts they get from their customer comply and to do appropriate inspections. And I work for a company that makes vehicles, and we do that same thing. We have parts that are supplied by subcontractor, and they get randomly inspected. And the rate of inspection from a subcontractor depends on their past performance of how their parts have complied with the spec. And so you can eventually reach a level in the industry that's referred to as dock to stock, which means you're such a good sub-supplier and your parts are always within spec. So as soon as they hit our dock, we put them in stock. We don't even bother to inspect them. Just once in a while, we take a random sample and make sure it's still good, but we're not inspecting the majority of the parts anymore. So it's unclear who provided these bad bolts for the steering that's being recalled on all of these Model S's. And realize 123,000 Model S's, that's a little less than half of all the cars Tesla has ever produced. In their press release, they said that it will only take about an hour to replace this bolt. Now, the first thing I did is think 123,000 cars, and you have about 2,000 hours in a man year of work time. And so that's 60 man years of labor to perform the recall on all of these cars. So that's not an insignificant amount of time when the service centers are already backed up over Model 3 issues. And this was termed a voluntary recall. They're not calling it a mandatory safety recall. And they say that even if the bolt fails in operation, it simply disconnects the power steering. So you will still have manual steering. At low speed, it'll be heavy and hard to drive. And at high speed, it'll still be easy. But it's not a catastrophic failure that will crash and kill you. Now, what I read online from various sources is that these bolts are made by Bosch. And Bosch had a similar problem supplying these same type of bolts for power steering systems to Ford in 2016. And Ford conducted the recalls in 2016. And I've also seen Tesla forums where people had talked about this problem over a year ago, talked with the service center about it. So it's not an issue that suddenly came to Tesla's attention. It's an issue that's been known for quite some time. And they've just now released this recall and called it a voluntary recall. And it's going to be pretty expensive to fix. And it affects, like I said, nearly half the cars they ever built. Now, all through this time, you have all these events happening throughout the week. And Tuesday and Wednesday, both, the stock price of Tesla drops about 8 or 9% both days. And it set new 52-week lows. It was back below $300. On Thursday, it rallied about 3%, I think, to close for the long holiday weekend. Some unconfirmed reports and arguably unsubstantiated were that the whole Fremont factory was shutting down for Thursday and Friday for the holidays, which is really odd if you're trying to push out cars for the end of the quarter, if you have all these problems that are slowly sinking your company to close the factory for a couple days. But Tesla has fought off unionization attempts in the last couple of years, so it may be a calculated risk where the company says, can we give the guys a day off, a couple of days off in all of this mess, and maybe keep the union out a little longer. Saturday rolls around, March 30th. Tesla publishes a blog update about the crash on the 101 in Mountain View the previous week. They confirmed that it did happen with Autopilot enabled, and there's a lot more great squirrely language. I read the thing, and I read the update directly from Tesla's website, and there's a lot of things that popped out to me. So Teslas collect a lot of telemetry data while they're driving, and they store it for some amount of time. I'm not sure. But Tesla was able to retrieve the computer from this Model X that crashed, and they were able to retrieve the telemetry data. And they kind of play possum in this press release about what they know. And they pretend like, we only know these things so far. And the reality is they know the whole story. So in my background, I've done flight test data collection. I've done flight test data reduction. I've done flight test data analysis, and I've done reconstruction of bad data when sensors fail, when things aren't calibrated correctly, but you had a flight test that cost several $1,000,000 to perform. It can't be re-performed to produce new data, and you have to figure out how to reconstruct the data. So I have a not insignificant history of this type of exact data analysis. And so when I read their update, they talk about things like the driver had received several visual and one audible hands-on warning earlier in the drive, and the driver's hands were not detected on the wheel for 6 seconds prior to the collision. So, when it says that the driver had been warned to put his hands on the wheel earlier in the drive, how much earlier? That's important to know. And every frame of that data that you get from these kind of telemetered systems has a timestamp on it. So Tesla knows exactly when the driver was warned to put his hands on the wheel, but they don't say. They don't say whether or not it was relevant to the crash. Was it 30 minutes earlier when he was 20 miles away in traffic, he took his hands off the wheel? And so it strikes me as very, not really weird. I mean, they're trying to obscure the information here, and they're trying not to release much. And then they also say that the second part of that sentence, that the driver's hands were not detected on the wheel for 6 seconds prior to collision. So that's interesting in itself. The way that the steering wheel on a Tesla detects that your hands are on it is that you slightly apply a torque to the wheel as you're holding it. So the computer says the wheel should be in some angular position. And then your hand is kind of pulling it just barely out of that position. Now, if it's just a little bit out of that position, it says, that's okay, that's the driver's hands on the wheel, we want that, but continue in autopilot. If you pull it too far out of that angular position, it says, now the driver is trying to take over control of the vehicle, disable autopilot, and let him control the vehicle. And if there's no torque on the steering wheel, it's not pulled out of position at all, it says, the driver's hands are off the wheel, give him a warning. And this is exactly how these kind of systems work in aircraft, both in airplanes and helicopters. When you're trimmed up in autopilot mode, you have a trim position on the sticks that the system is holding the stick at in order to have the plane fly a certain way. And then the pilot puts his hand on the stick, and he can move the stick just a slight amount, and it'll say, your hand's on the stick, but you're just doing it for reassurance, you're just doing it to have your hand there for safety in case something happens, or whatever. But when the pilot moves the stick too far out of that trim position, it says, you really want to control this plane, have at it. And so it's working the same way here with a Tesla. Now, they say the driver's hands were not detected on the wheel for 6 seconds prior to collision. Well, that doesn't mean his hands weren't on the wheel. And people have complained online, Tesla owners have complained a lot, that sometimes they have their hands on the wheel and they're not moving the wheel out of its set angular position, and they get a warning to put their hands back on the wheel. So Tesla cannot know whether or not he had his hands on the wheel, and it is material to the investigation of the accident. But instead of saying, we don't know if his hands were on the wheel, they instead wordsmith this as, his hands were not detected on the wheel for 6 seconds prior to the collision. And so, if you have a reader who doesn't have a background in these same subjects, they would say, oh, well, he wasn't on the wheel, he just wasn't paying attention, and then everything went bad and he died. But the reality is, Tesla doesn't even know if his hands were on the wheel. Another thing they say in this is, the driver had about 5 seconds and 150 meters of unobstructed view of the concrete divider with the crushed crash attenuator, but the vehicle logs show that no action was taken. So this whole sentence is very confusing. If the driver could see the obstruction for 5 seconds and 150 meters, why didn't the sensors on the car see it?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, you laugh, but that's the first thing we should ask ourselves. He was in autopilot mode. Tesla did confirm that. He was in autopilot mode. Why didn't Autopilot see it? And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about what was the nature of the crash. Did he slowly veer into it? Did the car whip into it at the last moment? That's something that Tesla needed to answer. They have that answer already, but instead they carefully craft these sentences that don't really tell us anything. They use a whole lot of truth. There's no incorrect statements here. And they use a whole lot of truthful statements strung together to tell you a lie. And it goes on and on. They go on to talk about how the first iteration of Autopilot was found by the US government to reduce crash rates by as much as 40%. And that whole statement is so full of fuckery. It's the problem is Tesla no longer uses the first iteration of Autopilot. The first iteration of Autopilot was software provided by Mobileye, which severed its cooperation with Tesla 2 years ago. And Tesla was forced to go out on their own and start rewriting their autopilot system from scratch at that point. So the fact that the first iteration provided by another company, which is no longer available to drivers, was found by the US government to reduce crash rates by as much as 40% is immaterial to this case. The other problem is that 40% number comes simply from a study the government did that showed that automatic electronic braking, where your car uses a front-looking radar to tell if you're going to rear end somebody, that Aiibi reduces your crash rate by 40%. And their first iteration Autopilot, it's a level 2 autonomy, which is cruise control and Aiibi. So any car with automatic electronic braking reduces your crash rates by 40%, the government has found. That's not unique to Tesla. It's not unique to Autopilot, any generation of Autopilot. And so, again, this is a sentence loaded with facts designed to tell you a lie. And it goes on and on from here. I would encourage you to go to Tesla's website. The blog post is entitled An Update on Last Week's Accident. It's very enjoyable if you want to throw your critical engineering eye towards it. I could only imagine that the Tesla's director of corporate communications and their chief legal counsel had simultaneous orgasms as they pinned the last period on this press release. It's the wordsmithing just goes to dizzying new heights. So overall, at the end of the week, the stock was down 15%. Options betting on bankruptcy were up almost 300%. And things definitely soured and looked worse. So the biggest thing I noticed was the media sentiment. Regular dumb business journalists, the dumb financial press. Normally, the last 10 years, all they can do is fawn over Elon, repeat everything he says as fact, and not do any critical thinking. And it's turning to the point, it started turning last November, where they would kind of say, Tesla's got some cash problems, or Tesla's struggling. Now, in the last week, they start using words like collapse and bankruptcy and things like that. So even the dumbest of the dumb journalists in the financial press are catching on to the fact that the company is in real trouble. Going forward, if you want to say, Craig, what do you predict so you look like a sage in the future? Tesla needs money desperately. I would estimate that between now and the end of 2019, they need about $9 billion. And that's just to get the Model 3 finally running right, normal money they lose on every S and X that they produce, paying all those accounts payable, all the rest of the boondoggle stuff that they have very little choice over whether or not to pay. If they want to keep being a company, they need about $9 billion of new money from the outside. That's not revenue. It's not profit. There are no profits. It's money from investors dumb enough to keep giving them money at this point. Now, People disagree. Some estimates I've seen are as low as $4 billion, but I think it's closer to 9. And I've seen estimates that are even higher. They're going to, like I said earlier, they're going to release their financial numbers probably the second week of May of 2018, the financial numbers for Q1. Things to look for in there is what is their cash on hand at the end of Q1 and what were their accounts payable. Don't let them play that trick on you again. Go find the accounts payable and subtract that from the cash on hand to see what is it really. And there are other items. I mean, they do have some accounts receivable. They have a lot other items that affect what their real cash on hand is. But the big one is the accounts payable, because that's the one that just is such a huge percentage of their cash on hand, and it's growing so fast over the last several quarters. So go look at the financial statement the second week of May when it comes out and subtract accounts payable from cash on hand and see, is it more or less than $1 billion? Because $1 billion is about what they had when you did that math at the end of Q4. The other thing to look for that'll be coming up here on probably Wednesday, April 4th, is how many cars did they deliver? You really have to put a critical eye towards that press release. You would think a number like how many cars would be one they can't fudge much. Sometimes they'll mix up and they'll say, we produced this many S's and we delivered this many X's, but they won't tell you vice versa, so you can know the total numbers. And again, there are always cars in transit. There are cars that are produced and become part of loaner fleets or showroom models or whatever. And so they're always trying to hide these numbers. So go look and see what those are and see if you could tease out what S and X combined production is and see how close it came to their implied guidance of 25,000 for the quarter. And then see what kind of wordsmithing they do for Model 3 production at the end of the first quarter. Because I bet they're going to report something like 2,000 per week. That's my guess on what they'll report. I think their actual run rate is probably something about 2/3 of that or so. I bet they're at somewhere about 1,100 realistically. But I think they're going to report 2,000 with these very fudgy numbers that they use by bursting production in the last couple of days, like the leaked emails said they were. And then also on the financial reports, did they lose $1 billion in the first quarter? I think they'll lose $1 billion. I think the bottom line loss of the entire company will be over $1 billion for the quarter, which should be another new record of losses.
So say they get this cash infusion and they make it to the end of 2019. What would they even do then? How would they survive 2020?
They'll still be losing money on every SX that they sell. They'll be losing money on most or all of the Model 3s that they sell. They could maybe start producing, depending on what they do with that cash and what they do during 2019, they could maybe start producing Roadster 2s. The Roadster 2 would be a great product. And see, if Tesla had not decided to go mass market, had not decided to produce the Model 3, if they had stayed with the S and the X, maybe one day got in the production worked out where they could make a profit off those cars and then start producing the Roadster 2. The Roadster 2 is the kind of car that'll have giant margins on it. I mean, companies like Lamborghini make insane gross margins on their cars, and they make a lot of profit too. And that's the kind of car Tesla needs to be making. And so if they made it to 2020 and they had spent 2019 trying to start build up an assembly line for that at a new factory, because the Fremont factory doesn't have room for a third assembly line, maybe they could eventually put that in production, but they need to go through the production part approval process. They need to go through production line beta testing. They need to go through professional beta testing of the car. So then they have to survive another whole year before they can actually start producing production quality versions of the Roadster 2. And so even if they make it to January 1st of 2020, it's a bleak future. They still have, at that point, fewer liabilities because they have a lot of very expensive bonds coming due between now and the end of 2019. But I mean, their liabilities are still going to be on the order of, well, actually, no, they would have more liabilities because they're getting this $9 billion cash infusion. And some of that $9 billion just goes to pay off old bonds. So their total liabilities will probably grow somewhere about $6 billion between here and there. So they'll have over $30 billion of liabilities. And a lot of that is stuff that you're paying interest on. I mean, their interest expenses now are over $150 million per quarter. Ask yourself, if you're highly optimistic and you think that one day they could make $5,000 of bottom line profit on every Model 3, but they're paying $150 million a quarter in interest expenses, they've got to make 30,000 of those cars every quarter just to cover those interest expenses. And so even if they get to 2019, even if somebody's dumb enough to give them $9 billion, even if 9 billion people are dumb enough to each give them $1, it's still an incredibly bleak future. We're still looking at a 9-year-old bull market right now that's teetering. It's, the Fed keeps raising interest rates. That's never good for the market. We're on a very long auto cycle. The automotive industry is cyclical itself. It is long in the tooth too, and ready for a downturn. There's a lot of outside factors still against Tesla, even if it gets to 2020. So I would say even if it got there, it would still be headed for bankruptcy. I don't think it'll make it to January 1st, 2020, though. If I was not able to make multiple bets in the market by buying puts with various expiration dates, and I could only make a single bet, and I had to make my entire bet on one time period, it would be Q3 of 2019. Because in Q3, they have several $1 billion of bonds coming due, all within about 6 weeks of each other. And it's a lot. I mean, it's a huge amount of cash. And in order to survive that event, they're going to have to raise money. They're going to have to find somebody who says, I feel confident loaning you this money, knowing that you're not using it to grow your business. You're not using it for anything that may pay off in the future. All you're using it for is to pay those other guys that loaned you money in the past. Essentially, you'll be helping Tesla roll over its credit cards. And I think that's going to be a very hard sell when they get to Q3 of 2019. And like I said, if I could only make one bet, that would be my bet.
So another thing that's only somewhat related to this, the other day you were explaining to me what SolarCity's business model was. I think that's something that most listeners will be unfamiliar with, but I think it's sort of relevant to demonstrate why the purchase of SolarCity was not as synergistic as some people might claim that it was.
Yeah. So SolarCity was a company started by essentially Elon Musk, his two cousins, Lyndon and Peter, and his brother, Kimball. So those are kind of the four players here of the Musk clan when people talk about it, because they're the ones who are in the United States and are relevant. They're South African by heritage, or I guess they're Boers, really. And they had this idea in the early 2000s. Now, Elon Musk at the time was already a 100 millionaire or maybe a billionaire at that point in the early 2000s. He had sold his early startup company, I think it was called Zip2. He had sold it for like $200 million. Then he had gone on to start X.com, which was eventually purchased by PayPal. He eventually became the CEO of PayPal, and he was fired from that role by the board at PayPal. And then sometime around 2004, 2006 or so, as the story goes, according to interviews with the Musk clan, they were in a car driving to Burning Man, and they got to talking, and they had an idea for the business model that would eventually become SolarCity. And The way the Solar City business model works is that the US government had said, we want more people to install solar panels on their houses. So they passed this law and they said that you would get this big, juicy credit, a tax credit, when you install a solar panel system on your house. So they dreamed up this business. And the way Solar City worked was a salesman would come to you and he would give you all these highly optimistic numbers about if you install a Solar City panel system on your house, it'll produce this much power and it will save you this much money off your electric bill. And they would talk to you about this. And the problem was solar power systems, especially in the mid 2000s, were still very expensive. And so most homeowners could not afford it. Now, if you could afford it, Solar City would sell you one. But what they would offer is to lease you a system that Solar City owned. And some of the terms of the lease were that your lease payment would go up every year by 2 or 3%. Well, in the early 2000s, we were having this small oil crisis, an energy crisis, and energy rates were going up, 7-10% a year. And so you take these homeowners and you say, look, we're only going to raise your cost of this solar panel lease by 2 or 3% per year in the contract. And so most homeowners said, hey, that's a good deal because I've seen this happen for 2 or 3 years. It'll definitely go on forever. And you would agree to this lease, and it had some term, like 30 years, I believe, was what the term was for most of the leases. And they would come out, they'd install the system on your house, and then the first thing you would realize is it didn't produce anywhere near the amount of power that the salesman had told you it would. And if you go look at sites like Better Business Bureau and Consumer Reports and things like that, it's just customer after customer with a complaint about Solar City and the fact that now instead of paying $100 a month in an electric bill, they're paying $70 a month in electric bill, and they're paying $115 to Solar City to lease the solar panels. And so they would install these lease systems. Well, because Solar City owned the system, they got to claim the tax credit from the US government. So immediately they could claim this juicy tax credit from taxpayer dollars. And then they would roll up all these leases. So you'd have, these contractual obligations from homeowners. They would roll them up and they would securitize them and they would sell them to investors. And so basically Solar City was taking a present payment in exchange for giving up the future lease payments, which were going to increase in value by a contractually stipulated 2 or 3% per year. And so investors, of course, they love this stuff because look, we're gonna increase our payment every year for 30 years, and you've rolled up, I don't know, hundreds of these leases in each of these securitized packages. And so, some people's homes will get repossessed or they'll default on this lease or whatever. Some of them will fall out and there's some risk of that. But man, this thing, a guaranteed investment that increases its payout 2 or 3% per year every year, And so essentially Solar City was taking the tax credit immediately and then selling off for nearly the full install value, or maybe more, the present value of the future payments of the lease. And so, this was a great deal. This is a great business model. And in total, they made about $3 billion just from the taxpayer-funded government tax credits for installing these systems on people's houses, was the total take. Now, eventually, uptake of people installing residential solar kind of took a turn. The Chinese flooded the market with cheap panels. More companies got in on the scam. Eventually they had a great business model scamming the government out of this money, and more people got in on it, and eventually they just couldn't keep the business running and it was going bankrupt. The stock peaked at about $90. It eventually fell to $17, at which point Elon Musk himself bought several million shares in order to prop up the stock price. And then a few months later, after buying the stock for $17 a share, he, as CEO of Tesla, said, hey, we should buy this company for $25 a share. And so that was the end of Solar City. Tesla bought it out as it was going bankrupt with the claim that somehow a company that installs solar panels on houses, they don't produce solar panels, they just install ones that they buy. Somehow that's synergistic with a company that sells electric cars, I guess because electrons. But it was a total sham. It was entirely to bail out millions of shares of soon to be worthless Solar City stock held by Elon and Kimball and Linden and the rest of them, and also to save the image of Elon himself, because a lot of the reason he can still raise money is he has this image as a great visionary. And if his Solar City company that he was on the board of directors of had gone bankrupt, a company that he and his cousin started, it would have looked really bad to his image. And it was a total terrible deal for Tesla shareholders. They voted for it overwhelmingly, but essentially the stock of Tesla was diluted in order to trade for all this Solar City stock valued at $25 a share, only months after Elon had bought millions of shares at $17 a share. And that's where that lawsuit came from too, that I talked about earlier in this podcast. It's from shareholders saying, hey, this was a terrible deal. You weren't doing what was best for the shareholders when you did this. You were bailing out your cousins and your brother and yourself. Do you have any questions, Blake? I feel like I talked for an hour and a half and I kind of hogged the whole podcast.
I didn't have a lot of questions. Yeah, I can't really think of much.
To disclose to anyone who has not listened to our podcast before, I am betting money on Tesla's bankruptcy. So I have money invested in this view. Of course, if you have a problem with that, then if I didn't have money invested in this view, you would probably also have a problem saying that if I believe this so bad, why don't I invest in it? So
I would say that. No, I really can't think of anything.
Do you think they're going bankrupt?
Yes.
I keep thinking, I keep trying to second guess here and say, like, what could save the company? And some people online will like to say things like, oh, well, Apple will buy them.
That doesn't save them.
And so then so Apple is not a manufacturer. They're a designer who subs out manufacturing. Second, if you want to put Tesla in perspective, it's a company with a market cap of $47 billion. So if you wanted to buy the company, you would essentially have to buy all the stock. It would cost you $47 billion. You would be getting a company that has about $26 billion of net assets and $23 billion of net liabilities. So total assets less liabilities, you'd be getting about $3 billion of value that you would be paying $47 billion for, and it loses $1 billion in operating cash flow every quarter. So it's a really hard sell to say that any company would want to come in and buy Tesla. I mean, it's really not an asset that's worth anything. Now, if the company goes through bankruptcy first, there are parts of the company that are valuable and will be bought up, depending on whether it goes into Chapter 7, where it's recapitalized, or sorry, Chapter 11, bankruptcy, where it's recapitalized, or Chapter 7, where they say, this can never be a going concern, break up the entire company and sell the pieces to anyone who will buy it. So it depends on what kind of bankruptcy it goes into.
So yesterday I went and test drove a P100D, and one of the things I really felt about it was I wish I could buy like two cars, because it's not a very luxurious car, but oh my god, is it a fast car. And what if Tesla sold another product that was like a rolling chassis for other car companies? Because for example, you can go to Wikipedia and you can look at the list of fastest accelerating production cars. And I believe it's something like the Bugatti Chiron or Chiron or something like that is like number 1. And then number 2 is the Tesla P100D with ludicrous mode. And then under that, there's a whole bunch of cars that cost $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. And so it's just incredibly fast. And when you floor it, the way I described it is it's sort of like you push the gas pedal all the way down and then you hit everyone else in the car with the car. Like you just hit them in the back. That's essentially what it feels like. It feels like you're swatting everyone with the car. It's so incredibly powerful. You can go on YouTube and watch videos of people flooring it in the Tesla and everyone else in the car is like, oh my God. And the thing is, you can do that over and over and you keep thinking, oh my God. Like you think, yeah, my neck muscles are strong enough for this. And then they're not. And you hit the back of the seat. And I really wish that I could get a nice luxurious car that had a P100D with ludicrous drivetrain on it. That would just be awesome.
Yeah. So the problem with Tesla manufacturing that for other companies is that there is no proprietary technology in a P100D that allows it to do that. There's nothing in there that Toyota or Ford or Mercedes or whoever else cannot produce on their own, unencumbered by intellectual property.
It's true. Why don't any of the other companies make this? If it's as easy as stuffing the batteries and the motors into a car, why doesn't Lamborghini do this? Why doesn't Ferrari do this? Why doesn't anyone? Why do they keep making slower accelerating cars than this random electric car company?
Now, some of the supercar companies have started making hybrid and electric supercars. There are some out there. There was a Top Gear episode of them.
Yeah. There's stuff like there's like a Porsche 918 Spider or something like that. The car costs like, I can't remember, $400,000, $600,000, something like that. The 918, and it's slower to accelerate. There's the new Lamborghini, the Aventador S or whatever. It's slower to accelerate. I don't understand this.
Okay, and you're saying why don't they do this on something in the $100,000 to $150,000 range?
Or why don't they make a really expensive car that can accelerate this hard?
Or
it's just amazing. It's like breathtaking to accelerate that fast.
Yeah.
So, I'm just making up an imaginary product, but that's something that Tesla could just start selling out of thin air with no preamble.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's particularly likely. I'm just trying to think of what is anything that they could do. They could make their imaginary truck that they're never going to make because there's no real demand for it.
Yeah, that's a dead-end product. The amount of batteries will cost more to produce than what they're advertising that they'll sell the truck for.
Yeah.
The semi-truck. So that's a hoax product. Maybe if you had huge breakthroughs in battery technology, then Tesla could buy the batteries from somebody else who had that breakthrough. But the current battery technology, the current types of batteries that Panasonic produces at the Gigafactory for Tesla, those aren't going to ever create a semi-truck that will make a penny a profit.
Maybe they can make battery-powered roads that are conveyor belts. You just hop on and park your car, and the road drives you there.
It's Factorio everywhere.
I just really don't know. That's the thing. That's why I asked about the end of 2019 question, because the way I've been making this argument to people is people sort of implicitly believe in their hearts that Tesla's unprofitable now, but there's this profit switch, and they can flip it from now to profitable. And then they'll be fine. They'll start making a profit on every car or every car on average, and they'll climb back out of debt and they'll become a world's most valuable company, or even, a reasonable car company or whatever. But the way I describe it is there's no evidence that they even know how to build such a switch, much less that they'll get the opportunity to flip it. So I really struggled to think of what could such a switch be, and I don't even think it would be selling profitable Model 3s. It seems like it would be selling an as yet unannounced product. And they have 16 months? No, more than that. 20 months to do that, just to hit the end of 2019. And it seems increasingly less likely.
I think Tesla's fate was sealed long ago. And I think that it's just taken a long time to play out. And one day I think if they do go bankrupt, if we're right and they do go bankrupt, I want to do a podcast on what could Tesla have done differently to be a profitable car company. Because I think that's a very interesting and long discussion itself. But to shortly answer your question, I think they set events in motion years ago that ensured that Tesla in its current form would never be profitable.
Hmm.
And if you go back and you think about the Solar City business model, and then you think about Tesla and government subsidies to the buyers in the form of the tax credits and things, these weren't business plans that were imagined necessarily with great interest in ever becoming profitable. It was, let's get paid right now. Let's get a lot of stock options that we can sell, like Kimball Musk, for instance, selling his vested Tesla stock options, even to this day, sells them as soon as they vest every month. So maybe in Elon's heart of hearts, he did think, I would love to have an electric car company and like grow this into, a real big boy car company that competes with the likes of Ford and GM and Toyota. Maybe he really did, but I think choices were made long ago that precluded that from ever happening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share it with the smartest people you know. You can also join us on our subreddit, rfungineering. And do we have other ways of communication, Blake?
If you want to shit talk us, feel free to leave a comment on YouTube, and we'll never reply to you. We might not even read it.
Yeah, if you want to have useful discussion, though, we do look for it in rfungineering. So come to Reddit.
Yeah, we'll talk to you there.
I never thought I would endorse Reddit. Fuck me.
Or don't come to Reddit if you hate it so much.